Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of UCalgary's webinar series, where we're discussing the politics of cybersecurity and surveillance. I'm Deborah Yedlin, and I'll be your moderator today. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all our new viewers, thanks for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We started this webinar series at the onset of the pandemic. Our aim was to inform and support our community members by connecting them with COVID-related research and resources, but more than a year later, we've expanded our focus to include a wider variety of topics, but our purpose is unchanged: to share knowledge and discuss ideas and insight from guests and UCalgary experts with our community. Together, we can use research and facts to take on the challenges that face us. There is no doubt that we live in a complicated time. Technology is evolving quickly, outpacing regulation, and creating new challenges around privacy and surveillance that are influencing global politics and economics and our trust in communication technologies. At UCalgary's Lecture of a Lifetime last May, Dr. John Ferris shared his expertise on the history of surveillance and its impact on privacy in our modern world. It was a tremendous experience to hear his lecture and his responses to audience input. And the one comment that we got back when it was over was that we needed more time for all the questions. There were almost 80 unanswered questions. So Dr. Ferris has graciously agreed to come back today for an hour devoted to the Q&A with our audience. Dr. Ferris is a specialist in strategy and diplomacy, signals intelligence, and the role of intelligence in war and peace. He's authored 120 academic articles, chapters, and 5 books, including the recently released Behind the Enigma, the Authorized History of GCHQ, Britain's secret cyber intelligence agency, a 100-year history of British intelligence code-breaking. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a professor of history at UCalgary, where he is also a fellow for the Center for Military, Strategic, and Security Studies. Dr. Ferris is an honorary professor at the University of Aberystwyth and Brunel University in London, and an associate member of Nuffield College at Oxford. Welcome, Dr. Ferris, and thank you for being with us again today.
Glad to be here, Deb.
So since we are really focused on questions, I'm going to invite the audience to add their questions, and I'm going to start. Obviously there's so many issues that have come up since the lecture, and I'm going to start with one with asking you whether Canada needs to reduce its economic and academic connections with China.
I'm speaking only for myself, not for anyone else. It's very hard for us to reduce our economic links with China. Although I have to say we need to acknowledge that the PRC uses economic issues as blackmail very openly, and also is very much trying to take whatever technology it can get from foreign companies. But in the world as it lives in, we really cannot in general cut ourselves off from Chinese economy. We do need to understand that China is very predatory when it comes to stealing technology and research from any other country. And especially we have to understand that China treats all foreign countries the same way, in the sense that it tries to build networks among overseas Chinese communities, but also among political groups and business groups. China conducts subversion on a large scale. And by the way, I'm not particularly anti-PRC. I'm trying to be realistic here. I believe that if you look at what Canadian universities have been doing in the past 10 years, we have been extremely naive in our willingness to cooperate as closely as we have with the Chinese. And on the basis of what we know about what happened in the level 4 biological lab in Winnipeg, I believe that we have to assume that Canadian research has been used to back the PRC's development of biochemical warfare. So I think we have to be extremely cautious in giving China any access to any high technology developed in Canada.
How do you, that horse has left the barn, so to speak. So what kinds of measures can be taken to sort of mitigate whatever impact could come back to Canada as a result of this collaboration and other initiatives? I'm just wondering, what do we do? We've already been how do you unwind it, I guess, is my question.
I think we do a damage assessment. We will understand that we have been a victim of PRC intelligence gathering. It is generally believed that one of the reasons that Nortel, the crown jewel of Canadian high technology in 2000, disappeared, vanished, essentially as a company, is because its intellectual property was siphoned off by the PRC. And it's also generally believed that a lot of that material ended up supporting the growth of Huawei. I would say that if you look at our experiences with China, we have to say we haven't done very well. But all we can do is deal with the future. I would say that there are lots of areas of, say, academic research or business cooperation where a hard-headed assessment would say, let's cooperate. We're getting something out of this. But I would say that on anything which has to do with the highest forms of technology and anything that has any kind of direct strategic, military, or cyber connection, the word should be no. There's no treating with the Chinese on this issue.
Right. So, some of the things you've talked about, there's some parallels, some people think, that with what went on in Soviet Russia and East Germany. So questions come in by one of our participants, Dario. The Stati used to secretly break into apartments of targets and rearrange furniture and other elements of the environment in order to undermine the mental health of the targets. Are there any known parallel cases in terms of using IT to attempt to attack a target by playing with their computers and other electronic devices in order to, gaslight them and disorient them, I guess? And other, I'm sure it wasn't just the Stati, it was the KGB as well.
Well, first of all, yes. If you look at, it's more Russian here than PRC.
Okay.
But it's very, one of the things that's very easy to do on the internet is to blacken anyone's name. Anyone who really wanted to could easily falsify me and make it look as though I was involved in child sex perversion. And if that was placed out on the internet, it would be very hard for anyone who didn't know me to think anything other than, boy, this is a terrible pervert. I think that if we look at what we know about Russian and to a lesser degree Chinese cyber subversion in the past 6 years, that the way they've gone to, which is essentially to try to convince every aggrieved group that your enemies are even worse than they are, that we're looking at a pattern that's actually much easier of events. It's much easier to do on the internet than normally. Where the PRC is more of a problem for us is not on the cyber side of things, it's on the human side of things. There are Chinese consulates across Canada, each of which has to be regarded as a center for subversion and intelligence, among other things. That's not the only things that they do, but that's part of it. Confucius Institutes are a form of white propaganda. They're being used to try to openly shape views about the PRC in Canada. And when you get into Chinese language press in Canada, it's very, very clear that the PRC is influencing debates within the various Chinese communities in Canada to make it hard for its opponents to make their case and to do its best to spin a story that suits Beijing. So those are direct human forms of subversion. Now, the problem is, by having said this, people will immediately say, aha, John Ferris is a racist. And if you were to look at what our prime minister said last week, when a conservative MP raised very gingerly the question of Chinese subversion in Canada, that's exactly what Justin Trudeau did. He immediately said, well, you conservatives are racist. You would not possibly be accusing the Chinese of anything unless you were a racist. So there are lots of issues here which we find very difficult to deal with. But I would say that one of the things that I've come to be depressed by in the past 20 years is how easy it is to blacken the name of individual people and how easy it is to shut down any kind of normal open debate by demonizing other people.
Yeah. And we've seen that over and over again. Either you're with us or you're not, and the polarizing conversation that ensues. Yes. There's another question from someone who was part of the lecture of a lifetime. He's saying, in your talk, I seem to remember that you indicated that our best method of defense was the Canadian signaling intelligence bodies. Given Snowden's revelations and the fact that Canada is a member of Five Eyes, that it has been revealed that CSIS was and possibly still is intercepting Wi-Fi traffic at Toronto International Airport, that when members of the Citizens Lab at U of T were subject to physical intimidation from the Israeli Mossad, the federal government did nothing. So this individual is saying that the politicians are completely incapable of making decisions in the common good. Why should we rely on a government agency? Perhaps we need an independent body that oversees these issues. What do you think?
Well, first of all, you're going to need a government body no matter what you do. The bigger issue is what kind of policies do we have and how well do we adapt to changing environments? The environment in cyber has become much more problematical in the past decade. In 2010, it didn't look nearly as problematic as it does today.
Right.
We now know a lot more about how it operates than we did.
Yeah.
My only response, or my main response to that question would be to say, you need to have an all of society organization in order to conduct effective defense in cyber. The dilemma in cyberspace is that the attack is much more effective than the defense. If you find any weak link, you can actually then drive deep, deep, deep into systems. So the SolarWinds hack that came out 2 months ago essentially started from the fact that someone, probably a Russian group linked to Soviet Russian military intelligence, was able to find a way to attach a piece of malware onto the patching system for a very commonly used piece of IT architecture, which meant that whenever you as a normal consumer consented to receive a patch, the malware was automatically being deposited into your systems.
Right.
Now, I would say that the only way that you can really make defense work is if A, you have active private sector agencies bringing to bear their own capabilities, but bearing in mind that a lot of them are out to make money.
Right.
So you can't absolutely trust everything they're saying. And B, government agencies. And the government agencies, if they're going to be effective, will be working against our adversaries in their own home cyberspace, as much as they will be doing defense. So I don't actually think that the government on its own can make it work. And we always have to be very cautious about giving the government any additional power over anything. My only point here, however, is that we're now clearly in a world where we're under threat from other governments, private businesses, cyber criminals, no matter what. And so our hand has been forced. 10 years ago, we might have said, let's not worry about this. Let's not try to build borders on the internet. But those days are over.
And so we have to have something that's more robust to address to manage the risks.
And I think we also need openly to talk about what it is we're doing and why. I think there has to be some degree of what I would call translucency rather than transparency. And by that, I mean that you can never get a signals intelligence agency to be transparent. If you do that, it's burning most of its technical skills.
Sure.
But you do need to have a clear idea of what is going on and why. And I think the public has to be in a position where it can raise critical questions. Now, it's hard to necessarily get them answered. But if you don't have an open discussion about it, which in Canada we have never done, then you really do not know how to deal with these issues, which I would say are one of the 2 or 3 most important problems confronting the Canadian government today.
So, we've seen those cyber hacks and we've seen the impact in recent weeks, whether it's the pipeline in the States, another meat packing industry, JBS was also dealing with it. So I guess do we need to collaborate with other governments to do this? Do we look at our own, just look at our own issues? Like, what's the most effective way to address these challenges that we're all facing collectively? Because everybody's subject to that, foreign interest
I
penetration.
would say, first of all, every country that we identify as being Western, and I would include, for example, South Korea and Japan in that list.
Okay.
And we are bound together because we live on the same internet, we confront the same problems. It has to be admitted that we have conflicts of interest, and it has to be admitted that every one of those countries is spying on each other. That's the way life goes.
I know, and that's that's something we've known for centuries. This is nothing new. It's just taken on a different form.
But I can also tell you that at the same time as they're spying on each other, they're cooperating with each other against common threats. So I'd say that the very first line of defense is for all of us in the Western camp to say, we're in the same boat. We're going to have to try to cooperate generally to go after common problems.
Mm-hmm.
Second, what we in Canada have to do is work with the Five Eyes, which is far and away the most powerful intelligence and security body in the world, to maintain an even harder core for us. And that means that we're going to have to work with the Americans and the British in particular on, for example, offensive operations against the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. And there's no reason not to do so. Other European countries do. The Dutch, for example, odd as it might sound, actually are quite good against the Russians. But essentially, if we have common enemies, we have no choice but to work against them. But finally, it can't just be government and government. The real problem is that this is a matter where our society is under threat, and it can't simply be handled by government. And if you think about it, what I'm really describing is something that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
I'm saying that an effective defense really requires cooperation between every Western country and firm against common threats, at the same time as we also know that some of those Western firms and governments are going to be collecting intelligence on each other.
Right. It's cooperation and it's trust.
Yeah.
But there's a limit to all of it, because at some point your own self-interest comes to the forefront.
Well, why the Five Eyes works is because we agree that we won't spy on each other.
Right.
Whereas we have relationships with the Germans or the French, where we cooperate a lot, but we all spy on each other.
Yeah. There's a question about the Five Eyes. Actually, that's a holdover from the Lecture of a Lifetime, and the question is whether the CSE would the CSE have the capability to provide adequate signal intelligence for Canada if it was not affiliated with Five Eyes? I guess so I guess the question is, are there limits to Canada's involvement in Five Eyes, and does it hinder us in any way?
Absolutely. I don't think that we would be particularly effective, and certainly we would be much less effective than we are if we weren't in Five Eyes. The underlying points about the Five Eyes are you don't work against each other. You share the workload and you all contribute something to the pot. If you don't contribute something to the pot, why should we let you take from it?
Yeah.
And so all of that is to some degree driven CSE's activities over the years. But beyond that, we're a relatively small player.
Right.
We really, although the CSE is actually regarded with professional respect among SIGINTers, on our own, we would be much, much weaker than we are.
Right. That's, you need to leverage partnerships and collaboration.
Yes.
For mutual, to achieve those ends. Curious on your thoughts regarding the recent emergence of countries willing to execute espionage on physical machinery. This is, I guess, a Five Eyes question as well. Does it change, and what SIGINT will be? Does it change how and what SIGINT will be in the future?
Well, working on specific pieces of kit.
Yeah.
For example, doing things like installing Trojans manually rather than doing it digitally is something that's been going on since at least 2000. It is something which was going on in the Cold War. So the idea that somehow you can actually get into a specific piece of equipment rather than the whole model of that equipment goes back a long way. That's
Mhm.
actually something that would tend to be handled by a human intelligence agency. Does it affect how signals intelligence works today? Well, it makes it easier to gather lots of material simply because if you can get into an individual computer, you can actually then gather potentially a much greater range of material than you could do from a bug in an
Sure.
office in 1960.
Yeah.
But then what you're really in general doing is saying, okay, I'm trying to look for an individual computer that's got an air gap, so I can't get to it digitally. How can I get into it? Which was the basis for the attack on the Iranian nuclear program in 2008 by the Americans and the Israelis.
Right.
There was a decent air gap between the Iranian computers and anything else, but if you could get some poor fool to put in a thumb drive that was infected, then
Yep.
rapidly that whole intranet was penetrated.
Yeah, that was the Stuxnet.
Yep,
That's,
absolutely.
yeah, they were talking about. So the question here, why are the Dutch so good and what do they do differently?
The Dutch are good because they've never given it up. They were competent in the First World War, competent in the interwar years, and then after the Second World War decided that they needed to be better. They were very, very aggressive. So for example, the Dutch, this is a true story, the Dutch actually ran an agent in the American NSA, National Security Agency, in the early 1950s. And when the Americans found out about it and tried to spank the Dutch, they said, that's the way the game is played. There's good evidence to show that the Dutch were routinely intercepting every communication they could find in Western Europe from their allies in order to bolster the Dutch ability to win commercial arguments with their allies in the EU. So the Dutch, simply like Israel, sat down and said, well, this is going to be a way to get a lever over other powers.
Right.
We in Canada have been much more cautious in the way we play these games than other people do. Although I think CSE, since the end of the Cold War, has become more aggressive than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, the Dutch, different circumstances as a country for so many reasons and a different history. And we tend to be more cautious as Canadians because that's really our makeup for better or worse. So here's a question about, goes back to the lecture of a lifetime as well, also with Five Eyes. You talked about the probable dissolution of the Five Eyes network during our lifetime. Given the vast degree of data sharing that occurs between all the countries across a wide range of areas, what implications beyond surveillance do you see as a result of the potential dissolution of Five Eyes? What would that impact be?
Well, if you think about the Five Eyes, what it really is a formal part of a very loose coalition. The Anglo countries trust each other more on military issues than they do anyone else. They trust, for example, in our competence and our loyalty, as we do theirs. And so we're willing to share more with each other than we would be willing to share with the French, or than the Germans be willing to share with us. I mean, I think that in 2010, if the Germans had really wanted to enter the Five Eyes, we might have said yes, but I don't think the German population would have been willing to pay the price, which is permanent cooperation against almost every other country on earth, and doing things which a lot of Germans just don't like, given the way they've been educated since 1945. Now, since 2000, especially 2001, there's been far more cooperation between all Western SIGINT agencies than there had been before that. So there've been huge walls which blocked off the Five Eyes from everybody else. And now, in fact, I'd say the Americans and Brits share much more with, say, French or Japanese than they did during the heyday of the Cold War.
Right.
But nonetheless, that basis of trust isn't quite there. The dilemma is, will that basis of trust really continue with us?
Mhm.
And the American and British secret officers, who are friends of mine, have spoken to me and said they don't think the Five Eyes will last forever, are really saying, look, will the coming generation really be willing to cooperate as closely on the most important matters of national security with people holding a different passport than people in our generation or our parents' generation were willing to do? And my point would be simply that that's a very good question to ask, because really,
Mhm.
we are cooperating with the Americans or the Brits or the Australians on the things which are most secret in the Canadian government. And
Right.
we're giving foreigners access to those secrets of ours that we don't give access to any but a handful of people in Ottawa. So these
Right.
are really difficult questions. I think we gain from being in the Five Eyes. And personally, I hope it doesn't vanish, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, and I guess the question too is like, what are they outside the whole security or the intelligence side of the equation? What other benefits could accrue to the participants of Five Eyes, either whether as it exists or if it does dissolve?
If it continues to exist, the benefits are all in the military and strategic sphere. There's no spillover, for example, in terms of American attitudes toward economic issues
Mhm.
from the fact that the Canadian military and intelligence agencies cooperate with them. For what it's worth, although very few Canadians understand it, American military officers are very partial to Canada. They think a lot of Canadians because they like to cooperate with Canadian armed forces. I've been the only civilian in a room where the head of the American National Security Agency was talking to senior SIGINTers from CSE.
Right.
And they were joking about hockey. The personal relations really were close.
Right.
Now, those things help create a situation where the Americans actually don't use their weight on those issues against us.
Mhm.
On the other hand, I can tell you when it comes to any single economic or commercial issue, that's utterly irrelevant. It will not, in the single slightest iota, affect what is often American bullying toward us on economic issues
Right. Yes, and we see that
all the time.
softwood lumber starting again. I just want to shift a little bit away to another question that was asked during the lecture of lifetime that we didn't answer, and it was about your thoughts on Bill C-10, which would allow the CRTC to regulate / censor user-driven data on social media platforms. Um, what are your thoughts? What should we do as Canadians? Is it realistic to even see this as something that could be implemented?
There's a lot of
There's
confusion about what the government thinks it's doing with C-10.
okay.
They claim that they're not doing what you've just described.
Okay.
But if you look at the legislation, up until the moment it was amended about 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
it clearly allowed the government to do that. And even after the amendment, it's still possible that they could try. I personally don't think that they could ever achieve that end.
Yeah.
And in fact, I really am not certain that the old CRTC regime, which actually did a lot for Canadian cultural organizations, can continue in the internet age. But what I would say is that you could not, I think, in any way give the government the power that that one of the versions of C-10 would have given them over those issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Yeah, it
not sure
was.
that they could ever have acted on that power.
Yeah, and subject to court interpretation, which they probably wouldn't win, I'm guessing.
Probably not.
Yeah. Question that's come in from Dakota. I take your point that cooperation between Western democracies on cyber policies needed to address threats like IP theft and the spread of disinformation. How do you see the politics of cybersecurity and surveillance that you lay out affecting the politics of other issues, say terrorism, climate change, where cooperation with the PRC may be necessary?
First of all, I'd be very cautious in cooperating with the PRC on terrorism, given the fact that they've defined the entire Uyghur population as being potential terrorists. But yes, I agree that there are lots of areas where we have to cooperate with the PRC. As I said earlier about economics, Most of our economic relationship with China is mutually beneficial. What we really have to do is to define a few areas where we are going to be adamant that we will not allow transfer of technology or allow Canadian research to work for PRC interests, and otherwise treat the PRC as we would do any other country, which is to say, be willing to make a deal that's mutually beneficial and don't assume that the other side is always looking out for your own interests.
So another question came in, and it was, do we need a UN type organization to oversee these issues on a global scale? You know, and everybody's going to have their own thoughts on how effective the UN has been and will be, but is that something that even has a remote probability of success, or is that something that we need to consider?
International law maybe could limit some forms of cyber activity. The UN has occasionally attempted to define principles in this area, and a lot of Western countries have signed on to something called Tallinn 2.0, which is a set of principles which is supposed to regulate how governments can and may not use cyber in conflicts with each other. Now, the thing about international law, and I'm speaking here as a military historian who's learned a bit about it, the thing about international law is that most of the time, international law actually is honored, because international law actually provides a set of mutually agreed rules which define how people, businessmen from different countries, can work together, for example, or how individual tourists can interact with people from other countries. When you get to the most important issues of statecraft or survival, at that point, no one follows international law if it means suicide, ever. But my own view about cyber conflict is that it's extremely unlikely, for example, that Russia would launch an all-out attack on, say, electrical installations in North America or power plants, which is technically possible. In fact, one of the things that's very clear now is that it is technically possible to launch a very powerful strike against all sorts of elements of key infrastructure in any country. But I don't think that they would do that unless they were in an all-out war. That's almost a weapon of mass destruction, and they wouldn't do it any more than they would use nuclear weapons, because their assumption would be, we're going to be hit back. It is possible that we can constrain some of the ways that states have been using cyber for aggressive purposes against each other. But I have to, at this stage, then say, I do not believe that you're going to stop any form of cyber intelligence, because there has never been any international convention. There has never been any international law which has ever, in the least, stopped the collection of intelligence. And I'm also dubious that you're going to eliminate cyber subversion. So in other words, what the Russians did in the 2016 election, what they tried to do in the 2017 election, and what they accuse us of doing, and from their perspective, they have some sense of doing against them all the time, because they basically say, look, any broadcasts you make into our country about the superiority of your system are subversive. I don't think you're going to ever limit any of that either. As far as the UN, this is not the kind of thing the UN was set up to handle. It's unfair to blame the UN for being unable to stop wars or to stop conflicts. Right,
but do you think there's sort of an equivalent for the cyber world needs to be set up, I guess is the question.
I just don't see how it would work. Think about Interpol, which is perhaps the single largest international organization which deals with issues of security shared across every signatory, which is most countries in the world.
Right.
Well, Interpol does allow a fair amount of cooperation on low-level issues. But we've also seen the Russians and the Chinese, and I'm sure us too, frankly, use Interpol to try to further our specific interests in one case or another. So I don't believe that an international organization per se is really going to affect these clashes on issues that states regard as vital.
You mentioned something that, if you're using cyber methods to attack another party, you should expect, there should be expectations of being hit back. So if you are the Colonial Pipeline people, or you're another entity that has been cyber attacked and held hostage for ransomware, how do you see those kinds of retaliatory measures unfolding? We do things differently. I'm just in the West. I'm just curious as to what you think could happen.
I'm not really aware of any private party that suffered an internet attack which has on its own created an organization or hired mercenaries to attack someone specific. It is very common for these organizations to hire defenders,
right?
Some of whom may be good and some of whom, frankly, are out to make money and can't be relied on to have your best interests at heart. So in other words, all these private firms in the end are waiting for their governments to look after these issues. Now, our governments in the Western world really only in the past 4 or 5 years have been willing to sit down and say, not only do we need a national strategy to defend the whole of our society, but we also need to operate in the territory of the people who are attacking us and counterattack or attack them before they attack us. Now, what that means is that, say, GCHQ or the NSA are bothering the Russians and the PRC on a daily level. They aren't so open about their successes, but in fact, if you go carefully through newspaper accounts, you'll find that the Chinese in particular will admit to a lot of things which have gone wrong on those levels. But the basic problem is that we as a society are assuming that it's our governments that have to handle these issues. Right. Now, I think that that's a reasonable point, because I believe that we now have to assume that there are borders in cyberspace, and that therefore we need either a police force or a gendarmerie or a military on those borders, that there's no way around that. Whereas I've heard lots of people say in 2012, 2013, saying, we don't want that to happen. Our aim should be to have no borders in cyberspace. Well, that horse is left the stable.
Yeah. So just touching on your point about private versus public actors, how do we bridge the gap from intelligence services and governments to private companies and individuals? What do you do?
That's actually, first of all, I can name general ways that governments in, say, Israel, the United Kingdom, the United States have handled it. I don't think that we in Canada have done it the same way. Okay. In essence, what happens is there are lots of personal relations between people working in secret agencies and in the private sector. And those personal connections stem from the fact that maybe people worked with you and then went out to the private sector. Maybe you have two people who came through the same educational system and took different job paths. Maybe you've come to realize you have a shared problem and you have to cooperate. Now, under those circumstances, what has happened in 3 countries I mentioned is that parts of the SIGINT organization have become open. And that's also true in Canada. We've adopted the British model in the past 3 years on those issues. You create an open element of a secret agency, and part of that open element also is in the secret agency. But what this means is that you are then able to have open discussions between openly acknowledged civil servants and businessmen, people in IT, people in tech. And you're also able to have a kind of open discussion in the country if you want it. Now, in Britain, in the United States, and in Israel, in fact, in Germany too, what you actually find is an open debate on those issues.
Mhm.
And indeed, if you read around the technical press, you can actually find leading civilian experts in cybersecurity, like Bruce Schneer, who's quite critical very often of government SIGINT agencies, actually debating openly with the technical experts of GCHQ in open debates and discussions about how far government agencies should be able to constrain
Mhm.
the development of cryptography by civilian firms. Now, when you get to a situation where you have that kind of debate, I think you're as good in as good a position as you can. Because what it at least means is that there's a kind of relationship of mutual trust and openness, which we as people ourselves can judge,
Mhm.
which allows us to then think, well, what should those policies really be?
Yeah.
But we don't have that kind of debate yet in Canada. And for what it's worth, the people in Ottawa who are involved in these agencies or these issues are frustrated because there isn't a public debate on those issues either.
And that's a question that's just come in. Actually, somebody, Emil, has asked, what are the concrete actions Canada needs to take to improve its cybersecurity? And what would you like to see in terms of the proposals from different parties with respect to this area? Because we know most likely there's going to be a federal election. What do you think how should the parties position themselves? So that's part one for the question. Second question is, there's so much military infrastructure in Germany, in Israel, in the US, and the UK. Does that also hinder Canada in terms of its ability to look at things a bit differently?
Well, for what it's worth, the Germans are much less militarized than Israel, the British, and the Americans. Not
Okay.
much more than we are. Their military is actually has much less importance in German society than it does in the other countries I've mentioned. And there's a real inhibition in Germany about the idea of creating an intelligence agency that can monitor your own people. Now, in fact, they do. And one of the dirty little secrets of the relationship between the Americans and British on the one hand and Western European countries on the other is that over the past 10 years, the European Union Court has consistently ruled that the procedures the British and Americans use to collect data are illegal and should never be practiced against Europeans. But in fact, it's very, very clear that European intelligence agencies borrow this material collected by the British and Americans and use it. Yes, they're loaned it. It's a trade.
Okay.
And use it for their own security purposes at home.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say for Canada is that I would like to see an open debate on these issues. Now, if you go back, say 4 years ago, with Bill C-51,
Okay.
which the Harper government was trying to ram through in order to politicize intelligence. It was trying to make intelligence and military issues a wedge issue in Canadian politics.
Right.
So C-51 in turn became highly politicized.
Yeah.
And there were lots of people on, I'd say, the left center of Canadian politics who thought C-51 must be terrible.
Could you just clarify what C-51 was for? I don't know if everybody who's listening
Basically,
understands what that legislation
set of
intent was.
regulations that would allow CSE and Canadian intelligence agencies to act more aggressively on the collection of data than they'd done before, and to do things, for example, like conduct a propaganda campaign against people who were thinking that they should do acts of terrorism in order to try to spook them away from doing it. Now, the important thing is that after Harper lost the election and the Liberals took over the file, when you look carefully at what the Liberals' new legislation was, in fact, it was 95% what had been Harper's legislation. They took out a couple of things that had been the most clearly politicizing of the points that the Harper government was pursuing, but otherwise it was the same thing. And what that goes to show is that, in fact, there was more of a consensus among the people in the liberal camp and the conservative camp thinking about these forms of security than you would guess from their public debate. What I find depressing about it is that there was no open acknowledgement openly in Canada saying, well, this is what we're doing and why. So in effect, most of what the Harper government wanted to reform in terms of the way SIGINT operated in Canada went through. But you wouldn't know it from anything that was said openly in the Canadian public sphere. And I think that's bad. I think it's much, much better to be straightforward and open, as the British and Americans were at that time. There were big debates in Parliament. There were big debates in the Senate and Congress, or the Senate and House of Representatives, over precisely these issues, where at least the public had some opportunity to understand why the trade-offs were being made. In our case, it was just done to some degree in the shadows.
So there's a question about social credits in China. That's its social credit system, which is a wide set of databases, initiatives, and how they monitor and assess apparently the trustworthiness of individuals, et cetera. Can you comment on that as a surveillance tool and how it's being leveraged? And I think part of this is that there's so much information. We're not properly equipped to really sift through to understand what's important and how we should be thinking about it versus not. So I'm curious about this question in particular.
Well, it's actually very important, because one of the major questions for all of us as citizens when we're dealing with the issues of how far are we going to allow our government to conduct surveillance to defend us? How far are we going to allow them to conduct surveillance among us as a byproduct of the means to defend us? Then in turn hinge on the question of, are we creating 1984?
Right.
And what the Chinese social credit system does is show that, in fact, it is possible with the kind of technology we have to move much further down the road toward a 1984.
Oh, yeah.
That has happened in Canada or the Western world. And that's one of the reasons why I want openness. And I believe in the rule of law over our intelligence agencies, because as an historian, I'd actually say that in the Anglo countries I've spoken about, the rule of law over what intelligence agencies do is pretty powerful. It's also the same way in France and Germany, although in France, it's much, much easier to use signals intelligence against your own citizens than it is in our countries. Judges have the ability to use SIGINT to collect information in a case in a way that's really quite remarkable. But what I would say, the other thing is that I am told, although I have no experience in it, that in fact, the social credit system you're talking about doesn't work as well in practice as it does in theory. So yes, if you are caught using certain keywords, or if you are identified as being a problem, then the people who are monitoring the system know what targets to go after.
And I mean, so many people use VPNs to try and circumvent everything, and they have a number of them going on at any given time to make sure that they still have access to what they want. So does that distort the information too?
Well, yes. A lot of things distort it. You avoid talking about certain topics. You avoid getting caught in the list of names that they're concerned about. So if you're a Hong Kong activist, you are by definition advertising yourself as a target. But if you are simply a well-educated, normal Chinese person who wants to play computer games, well, then you can avoid being picked up. So the real question that I would ask academically is, in fact, how far in society do these forms of surveillance actually matter? How far can they be controlled and directed to do what sounds like a big brotherly thing?
Right.
And at the moment, we don't have an answer to that question. But I would say that this is an area where we really need to be thoughtful and careful and
Yeah.
ensure that we don't allow that kind of thing to happen here.
There's a huge ethical component to this and a conversation that we have to have.
Oh, it's actually a horrifying one. Governments potentially have much more power than they did before in abilities to survey and monitor us.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, if we take away their abilities to do that, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable to organizations abroad that we have absolute proof are hostile.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very fine balance, and no surprise, because there is so much that could go against us if we're not thoughtful over it. There's a question that came in from Diana. She wants to know if we need to include any of Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria in the Western world collaboration. I'm not sure if this is in the context of Five Eyes, but just without broader collaboration from other states, does it become an us and a them? And what does that mean for future success, I guess, is what, if you want to go there.
Well, what I'd say is that I think that we have no choice but to deal with Israel for two reasons. One,
Okay.
it's an extremely powerful state with lots of useful material. Two, generally speaking, it's a Western state. We all have different opinions on Israeli policy, and with some despair, I still support a two-state solution. But I regard Israel as being a Western country and a powerful one. So with the Israelis, I'd simply say we should continue what we've always been doing, which is absolutely based on trade.
Okay.
The Israelis do not freely give, I guarantee, when it comes to intelligence, especially on SIGINT. It's absolutely, we'll trade you this for that. And the point is, the Israelis have a lot to offer. Now, when we're dealing with the Saudis, it's more complicated. The Saudis are much less powerful in intelligence terms or military terms than Israel. I regard the Saudi regime actually as being highly anti-Western. I believe that the Saudi regime, by promoting its politicized form of Wahhabism in the past 30 years, has really damaged Western interests.
And MBS isn't making it any better.
Oh, not at all. He's a
No.
really untrustworthy person.
Right.
But just as I would say, I would, in an ideal world, deal with the Iranians. I'd say exactly the same thing about the Saudis. You know, you can't not talk to certain people and hope that that will give you anything. Even if you're dealing with people who are generally hostile to you, you have things to gain. And although it's not commonly acknowledged, for example, when we went into Afghanistan in 2001-2, we were cooperating with the Iranians. It was all done behind back doors, but they and we were working against our common enemy, the Taliban. So although I don't trust the Saudis at all, I would still be willing to work with them. But what worries me about working with any Middle Eastern government is that the modes by which they collect intelligence involve torture. And that's just the way the game is played. I remember when I first heard in 2002 that the Americans were sending people to Syria for intelligence gathering purposes. The first thing I thought to myself was, right, we're sending people to get their toenails ripped out.
Yeah.
So
that's
those ethical issues really do matter.
One question that came in as well, just to switch tracks for a minute, was just the security in the Western intelligence that might have had prior indications about the two Michaels being kidnapped in China, or was that entirely the Meng Wanzhou issue and we shouldn't necessarily read anything more into it? What do you think?
I don't think there would have been any intelligence information that would have allowed us to guess that either of the two Michaels would be targets. And I don't think that there would have been any likelihood that they would have been kidnapped without us operating on an American warrant to stop her. So I don't think there's any way to predict what happened. I would say the lesson we should learn is a broader one, which is the Chinese do not as regards any small Western country, follow what we regard as being normal forms of diplomacy, they are willing to kidnap people.
Right. So one of the questions too that's come in from Tony is, every university around the world, Canada's no exception, accepts exchange students from other countries. And so how does that factor into our risk management profile? And should we be thinking differently about it?
I have a different attitude toward those students than I do toward cooperating with specific Chinese companies.
Okay.
You can, I believe, bring in students from any foreign country and give them a good education that works out to forms of mutual benefit.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that we probably should extend to the very narrow band of areas of national security a ban on the employment of students from the PRC and Iran, and perhaps a number of other countries, and recognize that we need to have security concerns in mind when we bring a foreign student on board. But generally speaking, I think that we gain from having foreign research students come to Canada or the United States or Britain.
Yeah, it broadens the ability, the research field in so many different ways.
Yes.
And and brings different tools to assess issues. So just last question about Huawei. Can you give your thoughts on Huawei or other foreign telecom components being used now in our telecom systems? Does it make us more vulnerable? Do you see the Huawei 5G network as posing a threat to Canadian security?
Given the fact that the Trump government denied Huawei the ability to use certain kinds of American equipment, GCHQ immediately said, we no longer can guarantee that the Huawei 5G network is actually not being a threat to British companies. And that means our hand is forced. We will be doing the same thing as the British, Americans, Australians, and Kiwis. We just haven't announced it yet. The bigger issue is the supply chain issue. In my experience as an historian, every nation that has strong commercial firms working in communications or encryption uses them for intelligence gathering when they want to. The Chinese are really not dramatically different than the British or Americans here. But nonetheless, we can't trust Huawei, and I don't believe that we can bring in any significant equipment from any firm owned essentially by a Chinese company. Right. I believe we are actually heading toward a situation in the world where some countries will refuse to buy Chinese kit, and some countries will refuse to buy anything other than Chinese kit. And it's unfortunate, but I actually think that we are being driven down that route, and we're very close to it. So in other words, I think that if we buy Finnish or Swedish equipment, which are some of the major commercial competitors to Huawei, well, the Finnish and Swedish governments, on the basis of history, will try to exploit that for intelligence purposes. But are Finland and Sweden a problem for us anywhere than in hockey? Whereas China is a problem.
But not in hockey. Well, with that, I know we're coming close to the top of the hour, so I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your knowledge and your insight and continuing the questions that were asked following the lecture of a lifetime. So thank you so much, Dr. Ferris. Really appreciated your thoughts. Everyone who registered for this webinar will get an email and a link to view this session on demand. And if you enjoyed our conversation, please visit ucalgary.ca/community, where you'll find more webinars and stories on topics that matter to you. Our next webinar will be focused on athletics on June 29th, and registration for that will open soon. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the wonderful day. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, Dr. Ferris.